This reading is longer than usual, and it's from Mark chapter 15, beginning with verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, and they led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they're bringing against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he, Pilate, used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. And now a man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. And so the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to the custom. And then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloth, and after twisting thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck his head with a reed and spat on him and knelt in homage to him. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they'd offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription on the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left, and those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him and saying, "He saved others, he can't save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also mocked him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, O God, why hast thou forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." There were also women looking on from the distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting for the kingdom of God expectantly, he went boldly to Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he was already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, he wrapped it in the linen cloth, and he laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There was a time that the disciples really felt like somebody because of the fame of the one who had called them. When you're somebody, people pay attention to you. You feel important. Sometimes you're even an influencer. It feels really good to be somebody. It feels so good that you want more. Because, you know, when you're somebody, you have people to boss around, and people laugh at your jokes even though they're not funny. You might be a performer or an artist or a boss at a company, or maybe you hold a government office or a church office, or stand at the head of a classroom as a teacher, or you're a cheerleader at your school, or you anchor the morning news. The week before last, Chuck and I on Thursday were out at the golf tournament at the Players, and we were watching a group of nobody golfers on the 15th green coming through, several groups, and there were just a few of us there, just a handful of people. Then the tournament volunteer, the one who holds up the sign or holds up his hand and says, "Be quiet," he said, "Oh, someone's coming through in a minute, and there's going to be a lot of people here, so you all need to condense yourself and be ready." And sure enough, the great player, Rory McIlroy from Northern Ireland, came through with a crowd going before him and after him, standing as close as they could and close to us, cheering. Jesus was somebody, and his closest friends who traveled with him and those crowds felt like somebody too. People loved his teaching, they craved his healing, they saw the power of God working through him constantly. And we know how important the disciples felt because Mark recorded right before this a conversation between James and John and Jesus. You know, James and John were some of the first to be called, and they probably felt like somebody, and they said, "Jesus, we have something to ask you." And he said, "What?" And they said, "Can we sit at your right and your left when you come into your glory?" And of course they were referring to his glorious kingship with, you know, the gold and the throne and all that glory. But Jesus said no. And he reminded them that those who are great must be servants of all. And the other disciples who heard this exchange, they found out about it. They got mad because they didn't want to be less important than James and John. So can you imagine now, put your mind in that Palm Sunday, the day we call Palm Sunday, how excited his followers must have been that day when he rode into Jerusalem and the crowds were all around him and waving the palm branches, which is for, victory and welcome and yay, something good is going on, and crying out Hosanna, which means save us. And they're thinking this must be the man sent by God. But in less than a week, all that came crashing down. That donkey was taking Jesus to a different kind of glory. He spent most of that week in the temple grounds sharing about God's love, telling parables, and making a whole bunch of people mad who resented him. Mark says jealous of him, didn't like the rabble-rousing. There's all kinds of reasons we can give for what was going on that day, but can you imagine the disciples cringing? Why does he keep saying that stuff? We're so close. Back when they were somebody, Peter and Andrew and James and John and all the others, they were probably always talking about how great it was going to be and what was going to happen and how wonderful it was going to be. But after their Last Supper with him, they were viewed with suspicion by the authorities. They were busy denying, hiding, running away. Each of the gospel writers give us a lot of details about what happened that day, and how often do we read that part of the Gospels? And Mark, who usually tells us something in about 10 words, stretches it out to several chapters of what happened after the day we call Palm Sunday. Mark expands on what we confess in the Apostles' Creed, and we will in a few moments. We believe Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. What do you do when you're no longer somebody? When there's no one to listen to you, no one that finds your words important, no one standing by you, no one cheering you on, no one admiring you, complimenting you. What do you do when the purpose you had in life is no longer, when you're not that person anymore, when you're maybe struggling with what comes next? Perhaps a retired person, perhaps a person that gets sick, perhaps a person with a big change in their life. Maybe you've had an experience, a loss, something that's happened where you're no longer at least that somebody. I remember when I was a young lawyer and I was in an organization for networking, and there were several of those, and they had network lunches, and more than once I sat at a table with a young lawyer who used to be an Olympic athlete. Even in high school, this person was a star and used to having people cheer her on. So every time she sat at our lunch table, the conversation would always go back to this person telling us every detail through high school, getting to the Olympics and what it was like, seemingly addicted to the past. You probably noticed that Jesus never set out one moment to be a revered person. He humbled himself to be born as a human being, and he was born as a human being to a young mother from a small town. In Philippians 2, Paul writes that though Jesus was in the form of God, he didn't regard equality with God as something to be exploited. He emptied himself in the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And we celebrate the incarnation at Christmas. That seemed like about half a minute ago. But we often look away from the incarnation now when we approach and enter Holy Week. The incarnation also means that Christ suffered the way we do in harm to the body, in betrayal, in being hit and being mocked and suffering. He was bound and accused, Mark writes. He was mocked, he was spit on, he was whipped and struck in the head. Mark writes they placed a crown of thorns. They had to make a crown of thorns. They aren't sitting around. They plotted it, they made it, and they put it on his head, and he was crucified like a criminal. And the sins of the world were upon him, and he bore all this violence and all this cruelty, not just there at Golgotha, but for the world. And he experienced what it's like to feel like God has forsaken you, to feel like God is not there. He said it, "Why have you forsaken me?" But God's power was not wavering or failing. It might have looked like it did, but it wasn't. God's plan was for the healing of the world through this event, for resurrection, for a new creation. And already the divine possibilities were working in the most unlikely people. Somebody stood facing the cross. And when he saw Jesus breathe his last, he said, "Truly, this is the Son of God." Somebody stood at a distance. Couldn't get any closer. She would have if she could. She stayed and kept vigil with her Lord. She refused to look away. She watched everything. She saw where the body was laid. Somebody cared for his lifeless body. There was no breath in it. There was no heartbeat. Somebody took it and wrapped it in a cloth and laid it in a safe tomb, put a rock in front of it. These were not the people that the world would expect to be somebody, were they? The Roman centurion who said what he believed, Mary Magdalene, Salome, and the other Mary who didn't look away, and Joseph of Arimathea, imagine that, a member of the council, and Luke says he did not go along with what they were doing, going and asking for the body, very courageous. He didn't care who saw. He went and took care of it. God is always redefining what it means to be somebody. We're not somebody because of our job or being big in the number 1 or 2 or 3 in the golf world, or being in the Olympics, or bossing people around, or having people laugh at your jokes, or what we've achieved, or whose parent we are, or any of that. We're somebody because God knows our name. We're somebody because we're God's child. We're somebody because Jesus died on the cross for us. Jesus knew the ugliest truth about the world and about us, and Jesus went willingly and died for us. We're somebody because we belong to Christ, and because we know we belong to Christ, we are ready, willing, and able to serve him, do whatever he wants us to do, and to be servants like he was. The somebodies who were at the cross that day, they spoke God's truth, and they didn't look away from hard things. And Joseph, he was just so gently obedient. You know, they were guided by the Spirit. Maybe they can be our inspiration during this Holy Week as we journey towards the cross. Maybe somebody here or listening online will tell someone else about Jesus, what Jesus means to them. Maybe someone will invite someone to church. Maybe someone will spend time with someone who is coming apart at the seams, who needs a friend. Maybe somebody here will read difficult news, and that's not hard to find, and read all the words and not look away from what's happening in the world and pray for those people and carry them in your heart. Maybe somebody will step out in courage and do something that needs to be done. Maybe somebody will let go of who they believe they should be or used to be or gotta be, and just live in the freedom of Christ's death and resurrection. May it be so. Amen. Amen.